In the summer of 2010, as Steve Jobs was unveiling the iPhone 4 and Facebook was crossing 500 million users, two former Skype executives named Janice Fries and Niklas Zennström quietly launched what many would later call the most beautiful music streaming service ever created. Rdio entered a world where Spotify was still invitation only and had barely launched outside of Europe, where Pandora was limited to radio-style listening, and where most people still bought individual songs on iTunes for 99 cents each. The music industry was in chaos, CD sales were plummeting by 20% year over year, and illegal downloading through BitTorrent was still rampant. Into this mess stepped Rdio, pronounced RDO, with a proposition so elegant it seemed almost too good to be true: unlimited access to millions of songs, wrapped in an interface so gorgeous that even Apple would later borrow from its design language. Critics immediately fell in love. The New York Times called it strikingly beautiful. Wired praised its gorgeous, intuitive interface. TechCrunch declared it superior to Spotify in almost every meaningful way. For 5 years, Rdio would consistently win design awards, attract devoted users who became almost evangelical about the service, and prove that sometimes having the better product simply isn't enough. The story of Rdio begins with its founders' previous success and their fundamental misunderstanding of what that success actually meant. Janice Fries and Niklas Zennström had co-founded Skype, selling it to eBay for $2.6 billion in 2005. But their relationship with music piracy ran even deeper. Before Skype, they had created Kazaa, the file-sharing service that at its peak was responsible for more music piracy than any other platform in history. Kazaa was downloaded over 300 million times, and became the most popular file-sharing application after the demise of Napster. The duo understood better than almost anyone how people wanted to consume music in the digital age, having facilitated millions of illegal downloads. When they launched Rdio, they brought this understanding to bear on a legal platform, but they also brought something else: a European sensibility about product development that prioritized elegance and user experience over rapid expansion and aggressive monetization. Rdio launched with 12 million songs available for streaming, compared to Spotify's 13 million at the time, but the real difference wasn't in catalog size. Where Spotify's early interface was cluttered and confusing, clearly built by engineers rather than designers, Rdio felt like it had been crafted by artists who happened to understand technology. The service organized music into visually striking album grids, made social sharing feel natural rather than forced, and created a discovery experience that felt more like browsing a beautifully curated record store than navigating a database. The design philosophy that made Rdio special also revealed the company's fundamental misunderstanding of the streaming music business model. While Spotify was aggressively expanding across Europe and preparing for its eventual US launch, Rdio was perfecting pixel-perfect interfaces and obsessing over user experience details that 90% of users would never notice. The company hired some of the best designers in Silicon Valley and gave them unprecedented freedom to create. Their web player featured smooth animations, thoughtful typography, and an intuitive layout that made finding new music feel effortless. The mobile apps, launched simultaneously for iPhone and Android, were consistently rated higher than Spotify's offerings and won multiple design awards. Rdio introduced features like heavy rotation, which showed what your friends were listening to most, and new releases, which highlighted fresh music in a visually appealing format that made Spotify's text-heavy lists look primitive by comparison. The service allowed you to see what your friends were listening to in real time, comment on albums, and create collaborative playlists with an ease that made social music discovery feel natural rather than gimmicky. But every hour spent perfecting these user experience details was an hour not spent on the unsexy but critical work of business development, label negotiations, international expansion, and the operational scaling that would ultimately determine success in the streaming wars. The mathematics of music streaming in the early 2010s created a business environment where user experience advantages meant almost nothing compared to scale advantages. Streaming services paid record labels between 60% and 70% of their revenue in licensing fees, leaving tiny margins for everything else. Spotify understood this brutal math from day one and structured their entire business strategy around achieving massive scale as quickly as possible. They raised $600 million across multiple funding rounds between 2008 and 2012, giving them the capital to expand aggressively and absorb years of losses while building market share. Rdio, by contrast, raised only $41 million total across its entire 5-year existence. This funding disparity meant that while Rdio was available in 51 countries at its peak, Spotify was operating in 78 countries and adding new markets constantly. More importantly, Spotify's superior funding allowed them to negotiate better licensing deals with record labels. When you're paying the same per-stream royalty rates but have 10 times fewer users, your per-user acquisition costs become unsustainable. By 2013, Spotify had 6 million paying subscribers compared to Rdio's estimated 1 million. This gap meant Spotify could spread their fixed costs across a much larger user base, offer more competitive pricing, and invest more heavily in content acquisition and product development. The network effects of social music sharing also favored the larger platform. If most of your friends were on Spotify, Rdio's superior social features became irrelevant because there was nobody to share with. The mobile revolution that began with the iPhone and accelerated with the rise of Android created opportunities that Rdio was uniquely positioned to capture but consistently failed to monetize effectively. While Spotify's mobile apps in 2011 and 2012 were widely criticized as clunky and unreliable, Rdio's mobile experience was consistently praised as the best in the industry. Their iPhone app featured innovative interface elements like swipe gestures for controlling playback and seamless transitions between online and offline content that wouldn't appear in competing apps for years. The Android app was equally polished at a time when most companies treated Android as an afterthought. Rdio was among the first streaming services to offer high-quality offline downloading, allowing users to save entire albums and playlists to their devices for listening without an internet connection. This feature was particularly important in 2011 and 2012 when mobile data was expensive and unreliable. The company also pioneered several social features that would later be copied by competitors, including the ability to see what friends were listening to across different devices and the integration of music streaming with Facebook and Twitter sharing. But despite having superior mobile products during the crucial period when smartphone adoption was exploding, Rdio failed to convert this advantage into market share. Their user acquisition strategy relied heavily on word of mouth from satisfied customers rather than paid advertising or aggressive promotional campaigns. While this organic growth created highly engaged users, it was far too slow for a market where network effects and scale economics favored rapid expansion over gradual quality growth. The content wars that began in earnest around 2013 exposed another critical weakness in Rdio's strategy and revealed how misaligned their priorities were with the realities of the streaming business. While Rdio was focused on creating the perfect user interface for music discovery and social sharing, Spotify was investing hundreds of millions of dollars in exclusive content, original programming, and preferential licensing deals that gave them competitive advantages no amount of design elegance could overcome. Spotify began securing exclusive album releases, signed deals for original podcast content, and negotiated licensing agreements that allowed them to offer certain artists' catalogs weeks or months before competitors. They also invested heavily in algorithmic music recommendation through acquisitions like Echo Nest, which they bought for $100 million in 2014. This gave Spotify's Discover Weekly and other recommendation features a significant technical advantage over Rdio's more manual, socially driven discovery tools. Meanwhile, Rdio was still focusing on interface refinements and social features that appealed primarily to music enthusiasts rather than mainstream consumers. Their heavy rotation feature, which showed what your friends were listening to most frequently, was beloved by critics and power users, but failed to drive the kind of viral growth that streaming services needed to achieve sustainable scale. The company's recommendation algorithms, while more tasteful and less intrusive than Spotify's, were also less effective at keeping users engaged for long periods. This difference in engagement metrics became crucial as both services competed for the same pool of potential subscribers and tried to demonstrate growth to investors and label partners. The international expansion challenges that emerged in 2013 and 2014 highlighted the difference between a product-focused company and a business-focused company with devastating clarity. Spotify's massive funding advantage allowed them to enter new markets aggressively, often operating at significant losses in order to establish market presence before competitors could gain footing. They would negotiate licensing deals country by country, hire local staff, create region-specific marketing campaigns, and absorb the costs of regulatory compliance and currency fluctuations. Rdio's limited funding meant they had to be much more selective about international expansion, often entering markets months or years after Spotify had already established dominance. This timing disadvantage was fatal in an industry where being first to market created compounding network effects that were almost impossible to overcome later. In key markets like Germany, France, and Australia, Spotify's early entry and aggressive user acquisition campaigns created situations where Rdio was competing for the small percentage of consumers who hadn't already committed to a streaming service. The company also struggled with localization in ways that Spotify, with its larger engineering and content teams, could handle more effectively. Rdio's beautiful interface design actually worked against them in some international markets, where their minimalist aesthetic and heavy reliance on album artwork didn't translate well to regions with different visual design preferences or where high-resolution images loaded slowly on inferior internet infrastructure. By 2014, Spotify was adding markets at a rate of roughly one new country per month, while Rdio was struggling to maintain service quality in the markets they had already entered. The final act of Rdio's decline played out against the backdrop of increased competition from technology giants with effectively unlimited resources and fundamentally different business models. Apple's entry into streaming music with Apple Music in June 2015 changed the entire competitive landscape overnight. Apple could afford to lose money on music streaming indefinitely because it drove iPhone and iPad sales, which generated massive hardware profits. Google Play Music All Access offered similar advantages, using music streaming as a loss leader to strengthen the Google ecosystem. Amazon Prime Music bundled streaming with their profitable Prime membership service. Against these technology giants with their cross-subsidized business models, Rdio's standalone streaming service faced impossible mathematics. The company needed to generate enough revenue from music subscriptions alone to cover licensing fees, operational costs, and provide returns to investors. Meanwhile, their competitors could treat music streaming as a strategic loss leader subsidized by profits from hardware sales, advertising revenue, or e-commerce operations. Rdio's superior user experience became irrelevant when competitors could offer similar music catalogs at unsustainably low prices. Apple Music launched with a 3-month free trial that was longer than many users' entire relationship with streaming services up to that point. The service also came pre-installed on every iPhone, giving it distribution advantages that no independent streaming service could match. Even worse for Rdio, Apple hired several key executives from streaming services, including Ian Rogers from Beats Music, bringing expertise that rapidly closed the user experience gap that had been Rdio's primary competitive advantage. On November 17, 2015, Rdio announced it would shut down operations and sell its technology and intellectual property to Pandora for $75 million, less than twice what the company had raised in funding over its 5-year existence. The acquisition was essentially a talent and technology purchase rather than a business acquisition. Pandora was primarily interested in Rdio's recommendation algorithms, mobile technology, and international expansion capabilities rather than its user base or brand. Existing Rdio users were given until December 22, 2015 to export their playlists and find alternative services. Many longtime users expressed genuine grief at losing a service they considered vastly superior to available alternatives. Music blogs and technology publications published obituaries that read more like elegies, mourning the loss of what many considered the most thoughtfully designed music service ever created. The shutdown highlighted a brutal truth about technology markets. Better products don't always win, and sometimes they don't even survive. Rdio had proven that beautiful design, innovative features, and passionate user loyalty were insufficient advantages in a market where scale economics, network effects, and access to capital ultimately determine success. The streaming music industry that emerged after Rdio's death was dominated by a handful of massive platforms, each backed by either enormous funding rounds or parent companies with diversified revenue streams. The era of independent, design-focused streaming services had effectively ended, replaced by an oligopoly of technology giants treating music as a strategic component of larger ecosystem plays rather than a standalone business worthy of craft and attention to detail.